Hello, and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Denis Dunicic. Before we begin today, I want to remind you to subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop on all of the international affairs and issues that are affecting every single one of us today. Our story begins today in Afghanistan with another update. For those of you who have been following our podcast, you understand that Afghanistan is going through a major humanitarian crisis. Following the United States withdrawal on August 31st, and more specifically the formation of a primarily Taliban-led government, foreign aid, primarily Western, and primarily coming from the United States, has dried up. Now, as I've mentioned before, this foreign aid, which has averaged about $8.5 billion a year, has been the major driving motor of the Afghan economy and the functional humanitarian stability in the country, averaging about $8.5 billion a year and being about 50 to 80% of the nation's GDP. This money is no longer being given to a Taliban-led government in Afghanistan. More specifically, about $7 billion, which the Afghanistani government holds in its national bank reserves, is actually held in the United States Federal Bank in New York. They do not have access to these funds. Addition to this, the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank have restricted their funding and foreign aid to the nation while it is under the current Taliban-led government, which the Taliban promised would be more inclusive, including women, people from different tribes, and political parties. This did not actually happen. The formation of the government was exclusively formed by the Taliban. More specifically and more problematically, including ministers who have UN sanctions against them, and one minister who is the Minister of Interior Affairs having a $5 million FBI bounty on his head in a connection to a series of terrorist attacks. These governments, quite simply, are not acceptable to the West. And while the Afghan government is not acceptable to the West, it is not going to be receiving foreign aid. That is not to say that the international community does not want to help. The United Nations has raised about $1.2 billion, which it intends to give to the most needy of Afghanistan. Primarily, the major issues concerned are food, shelter, and medicine. Recently, today, it's come to light that the Afghanistani medical and hospital system is beginning to collapse, with clinics not having the ability to sanitize their own facilities, which is a major problem in the middle of a global pandemic. In addition to this, hospitals have told patients that they're going to have to provide their own syringes. Now, when hospitals begin talking like a bring your own needle heroin party, you know the situation is pretty bad. And we've covered the financial and humanitarian foreign aid crisis that's occurring in Afghanistan previously on our podcast. There's no need to go into it any further, but I'll just give a very basic brief. Western governments are not going to provide extensive aid to an Afghan-led, Taliban-led government. But where the West fails, China is going to succeed. Today, China is going to be attending, or more specifically tomorrow on Thursday, China is going to be attending a virtual conference on the situation in Afghanistan. This conference is going to be under the precipice of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a very important international organization founded primarily by Russia and China, and it is politically dominated by Russia and China. This organization primarily serves to increase Chinese and Russian influence in the Central Asian region while diminishing U.S. influence. China's attendance during this virtual meeting is going to be about what it's going to do about the Taliban government, how it's going to solve the Afghanistani humanitarian crisis, and how the political and global situation is going to be moving forward. It's a general meeting or virtual summit on how China, the neighboring countries around Afghanistan, and the other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, including Russia, are going to react to the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan. Now, more specifically regarding China, the government of China has not stated whether or not it is going to recognize this Taliban-led Afghanistan. However, it has maintained cozy relationships, specifically maintaining an embassy in Kabul. There is still an embassy in Kabul. And for anyone that knows anything about international relations, when there is an embassy in a nation from another country, that country is recognizing that nation de facto. Whether it's doing it de jure, it is de facto being recognized as a legitimate country. So China most likely is going to recognize Afghanistan. And this is important also for not just for China's foreign policy and global influence. It's important for China's domestic policy. Keep in mind that the northwesternmost province in China, Xinjiang, has historically been predominantly Muslim. And there have been significant movements for this region, Xinjiang, to be independent of China, militant movements. And China has urged, specifically the foreign minister, Wang Yi, has urged the Taliban to not allow militant groups or organizations to help or assist or organize plans to fight Chinese sovereignty over the Xinjiang region. This is of extreme importance to China to maintain its domestic stability. In addition to this, China sees a major economic opportunity in Afghanistan. While Afghanistan is currently cut off from the international banking system and is fundamentally one of the world's poorest nations right now, it sits on top of a wealth of resources. And I've covered this in the podcast before, but just to go over it briefly, specifically $1 trillion worth, United States dollars worth of rare minerals used in the development and production of smartphones and computers, something that's absolutely necessary in today's technological age. These resources are absolutely precious. China has offered $31 million in foreign aid to Afghanistan. Now, this isn't much, and it's not going to make a major difference. Afghanistan is still going to need Western aid. China has also offered to provide 3 million Chinese-made COVID-19 vaccines to help diminish the COVID pandemic or epidemic within Afghanistan. This is being done to ensure its domestic stability in the Xinjiang region, to grow its international influence in the region, and to also open up more economic opportunities for China. And this goes to show where the West fails or where the West abandons, China is going to pop up. It is attempting to become the world's newest superpower. Moving forward, we go to another superpower, Russia. Yesterday on our podcast, we lightly covered the Duma elections or the Federal Assembly elections in Russia, which are going to be occurring from Friday to Sunday. Yesterday, we did not cover the elections on a more broader level. Instead, we focused on one specific candidate, Aloyna Popova, and one specific issue, domestic violence, or the introduction of domestic violence laws in Russia to protect victims of domestic violence. Today, we're actually going to cover the elections in general and what they could potentially mean for Russia, which quite honestly is going to be not much. As it stands right now, the major party in Russia is the United Russia Party, which is Vladimir Putin's party. It votes in his favor and it helps maintain his power. Currently, this party holds 343 seats, 343 out of 450 seats in the Duma, which is the lower house of the Russian Federal Assembly. Now, it's important to note that in order to be able to change the constitution of Russia, 303 votes or 303 seats are necessary in the Duma, which is a huge shift of power. The debate of how these elections are going to end and whether or not the United Russia Party is going to be the major political party in Russia is undebatable. They are still going to win a major majority. But there are three questions that are extremely important. Are they going to maintain the 303 seats necessary to have the ability to alter the Russian constitution? That is extremely important and can fundamentally alter the trajectory of Russian politics. In addition to this, it's important to note that Russian voter turnout has been increasingly decreasing over the years. And with such a low voter turnout, will it bring the strength and the prestige and the legitimacy of the United Russia Party and Vladimir Putin himself into question? Even if you win an election, if the voter turnout is so low, did you actually win? If the vast majority of people simply aren't voting, and they're not voting because they're too lazy, they're just not voting because they feel that they have no influence or because the elections quite simply aren't legitimate, are you a legitimate government? Are you a legitimate ruler of this country? Now, a low voter turnout could actually create problems on the international level for Russia and its recognition. Now, the final thing to keep a note of is de facto opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who is currently serving a prison term of 2.5 years after recently surviving a stint of nerve poisoning in a German hospital, has created a new movement called smart voting. Now, what smart voting basically is telling opposers, not supporters of different political parties, but people who oppose the United Russian Party, to vote for whatever candidate is the most viable to beat the United Russian candidates in their respective constituent lists. Keep in mind, in these elections, there are 14 different political parties. Of these 14 different political parties, probably only 4 are going to actually enter the Duma. In order to enter the Duma, to enter the Federal Assembly, a political party or a candidate needs 5% of the votes in the constitutional district in which they're being elected. Only 4 parties are projected to actually do this. Of those 4 parties, all of the other 3 parties that are not the United Russia Party, they all support the government. Particularly, the second largest political party in Russia, being the Communist Party, tends to toe the Kremlin line. Alexei Navalny's smart voting movement has actually shown efficiency and the ability to influence Russian elections and decrease United Russia's and the Kremlin's influence on Russian politics. On average, it has increased voter turnout for third-party candidates by 5.6%, telling people to put ideology aside. Do not vote for someone because you ideologically agree with them. Just vote for them because they disagree with United Russia, because they disagree with the current government. That's the entire principle of smart voting. This helped decrease a significant majority that United Russia held in the Moscow City Council elections, which occurred in 2018. A year later, major city council elections were held in 3 cities, all of which the United Russia Party would lose its majority in. Smart voting has actually been shown to have an influence on Russian politics. But there's a significant difference in these elections. Alexei Navalny is currently serving a 2.5-year prison sentence. He's in prison right now. Before, Navalny had the ability to gather protesters, to give speeches, to promote smart voting, and have a political platform. He cannot do this from prison. Instead, what has been done are websites promoting smart voting and showing voters who they can support, who is the most likely candidate to beat the United Russian candidate in a specific constituency. However, the Russian government has shut these websites down. Now, smart voting still has a voice, with mobile applications being available to the Russian people to do the same thing that these websites did: provide Russian voters with information on the most viable candidate to beat the United Russian candidate. Now, that being said, Russia has threatened Google and Apple. These apps are primarily available on the Google App Store, the Google Play Store, and the Apple App Store. They have threatened Google and Apple with heavy fines if these applications are not removed from their application stores. More specifically, the Foreign Ministry of Russia invited the US ambassador over for a meeting to tell him that US tech giants are attempting to influence Russia's elections. Now, smart voting is probably going to have a significantly smaller platform in these elections. And that being said, even if United Russia doesn't win as many seats as it has right now, which is 343. And it's projected that they're not going to, that they're going to win between 296 and 323 seats. They're going to lose some seats, but they're still probably going to maintain the 303 seat majority necessary to alter Russia's constitution. And even if they don't, the second largest party in Russia, the Communist Party, is probably going to be able to fill in these gaps and provide United Russia with its extended platform to do whatever it wants, even alter the Russian constitution. Now, these elections are extremely important, as I mentioned before, to the Kremlin, because this Russian Duma will be serving a mandate in 2024, right when Vladimir Putin's mandate is over. He is going to have to run for re-election. He's going to need the support of the Duma. And if a re-election is not an option, if things change in the next 4 years, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are going to have to look at different options for maintaining their power. It's unfortunate because these elections actually have the ability to change Russia, though the vast majority of Russians feel that they're not important and they're not relevant, and the turnout is going to be very low because United Russia is just going to win anyways. And even if they don't, they have other political parties who act as a quasi-opposition, but in reality always support the Kremlin line. What's going to happen after the elections? In 2011, following the Duma elections, there were major accusations of voter manipulation and election manipulation to favor the Kremlin or to favor the United Russian Party. There were major protests. However, that's probably not going to happen this time. The Russian populace is significantly less interested in what's going on and feels that they have a much smaller influence today than they did 10 years ago. Now, when we go to election interference and the fairness of these elections, that is another problem that has arisen. Russian elections don't typically take 3 days. The elections for the Duma are going to be held between Friday to Sunday, 3 days. Opposition leaders and opponents of this have said that it's just an attempt by United Russia to extend the days to make it easier for them to manipulate the votes and the election. Now, United Russia has responded in their defense by saying that the ballots will be recorded by video and that the boxes are going to be completely untamperable with. But is this true or not? That's hard to say. Typically, in order to assure whether or not an election was fair, NGOs or non-governmental organizations from an international field come in and monitor elections to ensure their fairness. Now, the biggest, Golos, by the United Russian Party and by the Kremlin government, has been called a foreign actor and actually added to the foreign actor list. Legally, they are considered a foreign actor in Russia. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to be unable to monitor the Russian elections. They are going to be able to monitor the Russian elections and give a statement on whether or not they felt it was fair. However, Golos' opinion is going to be significantly more speculated on simply because they're on that list. In addition to that, the Organization for Security and Stability in Europe, which is considered the largest authoritative source on elections and election monitoring, has stated that it's not going to be monitoring these current elections in Russia because Russia has simply created too many restrictions for it to properly do so. Are these elections going to be fair? Whether or not that's true, are they even going to be relevant? The Kremlin, and by extension, the United Russian Party, is probably going to maintain its majority, or at least have an ally to maintain its ability to alter the constitution, and Russian politics quite simply aren't going to change. And that all comes down to the apathy of the Russian people. Politics is a very silly game sometimes. In order for people to care, they have to feel like they're making a difference. But in order to make a difference, people have to care. So you're in quite a catch-22 situation, which is only getting worse in Russia. One of the biggest scandals and most effective methods of the Kremlin has actually been convincing the Russian people that its elections don't matter. And it should be noted, as a final note to this report, that on polls, even state-run polls, Kremlin support is extremely low. It's at a record low. Yet despite this, they are projected to have a landslide victory, which is completely inconsistent in any kind of democratic society. Comment what you think. Comment how you think the Russian elections are going to turn out, whether or not you think the results are actually going to be relevant. What do you believe could actually help change Russian politics? Also comment on the situation of Afghanistan. Should Western governments provide aid to prevent a humanitarian crisis or potential growth in terrorism, even if Afghanistan is run by a Taliban-led government? Comment whatever you think. I like to have an open discussion and have everyone give a fair and constructive debate so we can help just discuss these issues. That's the purpose of news, being informative and educational and attempting to be unbiased in the process. That's our report for today. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you